The House That Whispers in the Dark. When Samantha and Ethan first laid eyes on the sprawling Victorian mansion, it was love at first sight. Hidden behind a veil of towering oaks and surrounded by an overgrown garden, the house exuded an eerie charm. Its peeling paint and boarded windows seemed to whisper promises of a new beginning, a place to create their shared dreams. Newlyweds, eager to escape the suffocating bustle of city life, they were drawn to its solitude and the romantic notion of breathing life back into the decrepit structure. "Just imagine," Samantha had said, clutching Ethan's arm. "We'll fix it up. Make it ours." Ethan had smiled, picturing the transformation, a fresh coat of paint, new windows, the laughter of future children echoing through its halls. It was an adventure, a testament to their love and determination. But as they signed the papers, the realtor's smile had faltered ever so slightly. "It's got a lot of character," she'd said, her eyes darting briefly toward the house. Samantha had laughed, brushing off the hesitation as part of the charm. They were young, in love, and ready to take on anything. Their excitement carried them through the first few days. They scrubbed years of grime from the walls, tore up rotting carpets, and discovered intricate woodwork beneath layers of paint. Yet, as night fell and the house settled into its nocturnal quiet, Samantha began to notice something unusual. A faint whispering sound. At first, she thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the old structure. But the sound wasn't random. It had a cadence, an unsettling rhythm, as though someone were speaking just beyond her comprehension. She dismissed it, blaming exhaustion and her overactive imagination. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew more distinct. Lying in bed, she could almost make out words, phrases that seemed to echo her own thoughts. Fears she hadn't voiced, memories she hadn't revisited in years. Her unease grew, but Ethan was unconcerned. "Old houses make noises, Sam," he said one night as they lay in bed. "It's just settling. Or maybe it's the pipes." But Samantha wasn't convinced. The whispers weren't random creaks or groans. They felt alive, intentional. And as the days wore on, the house began to change. Subtle at first, a door that wouldn't open one day but swung freely the next, items she swore she'd left in one place appearing in another. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen tension. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, Samantha stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Flipping through it, she realized it belonged to a woman named Eleanor, a previous occupant of the house. Eleanor's handwriting was neat but frantic, her words recounting a slow descent into madness. "The house listens," one entry read. "It knows my fears, my regrets. It speaks them back to me in whispers that burrow into my soul." Samantha's breath hitched as she read. Eleanor's experiences mirrored her own. The whispers, the shifting spaces, the oppressive atmosphere. The final entry sent a chill down her spine. "I can't tell what's real anymore. The house is alive, and it won't let me leave." She showed the journal to Ethan that evening, her hands trembling. He read it silently, his brow furrowing. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but strained. "It's just a story, Sam. Maybe she was sick. People write strange things when they're not well." But the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, Ethan heard the whispers for the first time. They came to him in the dead of night, a low murmur that seemed to seep from the walls. At first, he thought it was Samantha, but when he turned to wake her, he found her fast asleep. The whispers grew louder, clearer, speaking of his deepest insecurities and fears. His failure to protect Samantha, his doubts about their marriage, his fear of being trapped in this crumbling house. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the whispers gnawing at his mind. As days turned into nights, the house's malevolence became undeniable. The whispers transformed into screams, guttural and tormented, echoing through the empty halls. Shadowy figures flickered in the corners of their vision, darting away when they turned to look. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with a sinister energy. Samantha and Ethan began to turn on each other, their patience fraying under the house's influence. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, their words laced with venom they didn't recognize as their own. Desperate for answers, Samantha delved deeper into the journal, piecing together the house's dark history. Every occupant had suffered a similar fate, paranoia, madness, and ultimately disappearance. She uncovered old newspaper clippings about the house's original owner, a reclusive man named Victor Holloway. Rumors swirled about his experiments with the occult, his obsession with immortality. One article mentioned a tragic fire that claimed his life, but no body was ever found. As Samantha read aloud one evening, the whispers crescendoed, drowning out her voice. The walls trembled, and a door they had never seen before appeared at the end of the hallway. It beckoned them, its presence both terrifying and irresistible. They hesitated, but the house left them no choice. The temperature dropped, and an oppressive darkness engulfed the room, forcing them toward the door. Behind it lay a staircase spiraling downward, deeper than seemed possible. They descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, they found a cavernous room lit by flickering candles. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror. Its surface shimmered, reflecting not their images but twisted, nightmarish versions of themselves. The whispers became deafening, their words incomprehensible yet deeply unsettling. The mirror began to ripple, and shadowy figures emerged, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They reached for Samantha and Ethan, their hands cold as death. Panic surged, and Ethan grabbed Samantha's hand, pulling her back up the stairs. But the house fought them, its walls closing in, its floors shifting beneath their feet. The shadows pursued them, their whispers turning into anguished wails. Samantha clutched the journal, its weight oddly comforting, as they burst into the night air. The house loomed behind them, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. As they sped away, Samantha glanced back. The house stood silent and still, but she knew it wasn't over. The whispers had followed them, faint but unmistakable, echoing in the back of her mind. The house that whispers doesn't let go. It waits, patient and hungry, for its next victims. The following weeks were a blur of fear and confusion. The couple's once unshakable bond had been splintered by the ordeal. Samantha became obsessed with the journal, poring over every word in search of answers. Ethan, on the other hand, grew more distant, retreating into himself as the whispers continued to haunt his nights. The more they tried to discuss the house, the sharper their arguments became, as if its influence still lingered over them. One evening, Samantha's curiosity overcame her fear. She decided to contact the local historical society, hoping to uncover more about Victor Holloway and the mansion's past. The old librarian she met there seemed reluctant to talk at first, but after some prodding, she revealed a chilling story. According to local legend, Holloway had performed a ritual meant to trap his soul within the house, binding its energy to his essence. The mansion had become a living entity, sustained by the fears and suffering of those who entered it. Samantha's heart raced as the librarian slid an ancient, leather-bound tome across the table. The book contained detailed accounts of Holloway's rituals, including symbols and incantations eerily similar to those she'd seen in the hidden room. One passage caught her eye. To sever the bond, one must confront the mirror. Only then can the darkness be undone. When she returned home and shared her findings, Ethan was incredulous. "You're talking about fighting a haunted house? That's insane, Sam," he snapped. But deep down, he knew they couldn't go on living like this. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. They could feel the house's pull, even from miles away. With no other options, the couple decided to face the house one last time. Armed with the journal, the tome, and an iron resolve, they drove back to the mansion. Its silhouette loomed against the darkened sky, a malevolent presence that seemed to swallow the light around it. The moment they crossed the threshold, the whispers enveloped them, more menacing than ever. They retraced their steps to the hidden door, now open and waiting. Descending into the basement, they felt the oppressive weight of the house's gaze. The cavernous room was just as they'd left it, the mirror gleaming ominously at its center. Samantha's hand shook as she opened the tome and began to read the incantation meant to break the bond. The air grew colder with each word, and the shadows around them seemed to writhe in agony. The mirror began to ripple once more, and the twisted reflections of themselves snarled and clawed at the glass. Ethan stepped forward, gripping Samantha's free hand as the room erupted into chaos. The walls trembled, and a deafening roar filled the space. As Samantha spoke the final words, the mirror shattered, its shards scattering like falling stars. The shadows recoiled, their anguished screams fading into silence. The oppressive energy lifted, and for the first time, the house felt empty. They emerged into the dawn's light, the mansion standing quiet behind them. Though they'd survived, they knew they'd never truly escape the memories. The whispers might have been silenced, but the scars they'd left behind would remain forever. Echoes of the forgotten. Adam Foster prided himself on being a skeptic. A renowned paranormal investigator, he had spent years debunking myths and exposing frauds. The thrill of uncovering the truth had taken him to some of the most infamous haunted locations in the world, but none of them had ever left him feeling genuinely unsettled. Until now. The Brookhaven Institute stood at the edge of a desolate stretch of land, its imposing silhouette framed by skeletal trees and an overcast sky. Locals had warned Adam against venturing there, their faces pale as they recounted tales of ghostly apparitions, maddening whispers, and people who entered the asylum only to vanish without a trace. To Adam, these were just stories, exaggerated over decades to scare children and attract thrill-seekers. But something about Brookhaven felt different. Its presence was oppressive, as though the building itself were watching him. "We'll be in and out," Adam reassured his crew as they stood before the rusted gates. There were 4 of them: Sarah, his tech-savvy assistant, Marcus, the cameraman, and Jenna, a psychic medium who had joined the team a year ago. Despite her talent for sensing energies, Jenna rarely spoke of her abilities, preferring to let her intuition guide the group silently. Tonight, however, she looked visibly uneasy. "This place isn't right," Jenna murmured, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't want us here." Adam ignored her, focusing instead on the equipment Marcus was setting up. Cameras, EVP recorders, and EMF detectors, the usual arsenal for a paranormal investigation. The crew followed him through the gates and up the crumbling steps, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder as they entered the asylum, the heavy door groaning shut behind them like a final warning. The interior was a decaying labyrinth of peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and rusted fixtures. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. As they moved deeper into the building, strange phenomena began almost immediately. Disembodied whispers drifted through the halls, faint but unmistakable. Doors creaked open and slammed shut without warning. Sarah's EMF detector spiked wildly, its lights flashing in rapid succession. "This is incredible," Adam said, his voice tinged with excitement. He had encountered similar activity in other locations, but never with such intensity. The asylum seemed alive, reacting to their every move. For Adam, this was irrefutable evidence of the paranormal. For Jenna, it was a harbinger of doom. As the night wore on, the activity grew more aggressive. Shadows darted across their peripheral vision, and objects moved on their own. In one room, Marcus captured a clear EVP of a voice saying, "Get out." Sarah's hands trembled as she replayed the recording. "It's like it knows we're here," she whispered. Adam's excitement was tempered by a growing unease. The voices were becoming more coherent, more deliberate. They spoke his name, taunting him with fragments of memories he had long buried. "You left her," one voice hissed, sending a chill down his spine. He dismissed it as a trick of the mind, but doubt began to creep in. How could the asylum know about his past? In the basement, they discovered a series of patient records hidden in a locked filing cabinet. The documents were yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible. They detailed a series of experiments conducted by Dr. Elias Grayson, the asylum's head physician. Grayson had been obsessed with curing mental illness, using unorthodox and often brutal methods. Lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and isolation chambers were standard practices. But the records hinted at something far darker: experiments designed to harness the energy of the human mind, to manipulate and control it. "These weren't treatments," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "They were rituals." The realization hit Adam like a punch to the gut. The asylum wasn't just haunted by the spirits of its former patients. It had been transformed into something far worse: a vessel for the horrors Grayson had unleashed. The building itself was alive, feeding on the pain and suffering of those who entered its walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the asylum were aware of their discovery. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and a low hum reverberated through the walls. Jenna's face turned pale as she clutched her head, her eyes wide with terror. "It's trying to trap us," she gasped. "We have to leave. Now." But the asylum had other plans. As they retraced their steps, the layout of the building seemed to shift. Hallways stretched endlessly, doors led to nowhere, and familiar rooms disappeared entirely. The oppressive darkness closed in around them, and the whispers became a cacophony of voices, each more desperate and malicious than the last. Marcus was the first to vanish. One moment he was behind them, filming their frantic attempts to find an exit. The next, he was gone, his camera lying abandoned on the floor. The footage revealed nothing but static, punctuated by fleeting glimpses of a figure standing just out of frame. Panic set in as they realized the asylum was picking them off one by one. Sarah clung to Adam, her fear palpable, while Jenna's resolve began to crumble. "It's feeding on us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our fear, our pain, it's what keeps it alive." Adam refused to give up. He was determined to find Marcus, to find a way out. But as they pressed on, the asylum seemed to taunt him, dredging up memories he had fought to suppress. Visions of his estranged sister, of the guilt he carried for abandoning her, played out before him like a macabre theater. The voices whispered her name, accusing him, condemning him. He fell to his knees, the weight of his past threatening to crush him. Jenna's voice broke through the haze. "Adam, you have to fight it. It's using your guilt against you." Her words gave him the strength to rise, to push forward despite the terror that gripped his heart. In the heart of the asylum, they found the source of its power, a circular room with walls covered in intricate symbols. At its center stood an altar, its surface stained with dried blood. The whispers were deafening here, a chorus of agony that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Jenna's eyes widened as she recognized the symbols. "These are bindings," she said. "The rituals weren't just experiments. They were meant to trap the spirits here, to bind them to this place." Adam knew what they had to do. Using the knowledge from the patient records and Jenna's intuition, they performed a counter-ritual to break the bindings. The air crackled with energy as the symbols on the walls began to fade. The whispers turned to screams, and the room shook violently as the asylum fought to maintain its hold. Just as they completed the ritual, the floor beneath them gave way. Adam and Jenna plunged into darkness, landing in a hidden chamber beneath the asylum. There, they found Marcus, unconscious but alive, surrounded by the faintly glowing remnants of the shattered bindings. The asylum's grip was weakening, but they weren't free yet. With Marcus in tow, they navigated the collapsing structure, dodging falling debris and the grasping hands of shadowy figures. The building seemed to implode around them, its walls folding in like a closing fist. Finally, they burst through the front doors into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The asylum stood silent and dark behind them, its oppressive presence gone. But the scars it left would remain forever. Adam knew he had uncovered more than just a haunted building. Brookhaven had forced him to confront the darkest corners of his soul, and he would never be the same. As they drove away, Jenna turned to Adam. "What now?" she asked. Adam stared out the window, the weight of the experience heavy on his shoulders. "We tell the story," he said. "And we make sure no one ever goes back there." But even as he spoke, a faint whisper echoed in his mind, chilling and familiar. "Adam, it's not over." That whisper haunted him for days after they escaped. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the stress of the ordeal had left his mind playing tricks on him. But the echoes of Brookhaven followed him, slipping into his dreams, where he found himself wandering the asylum's halls once more. Each time, the shadows grew closer, their whispers sharper, accusing. He woke each night drenched in sweat, Jenna's words from that fateful night echoing in his ears. "It feeds on fear." Adam threw himself into work, poring over the footage they'd managed to recover. The recordings were corrupted, distorted by static and strange anomalies that made it impossible to discern what was real. But one thing stood out, brief flashes of a figure in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly. It wasn't human. The realization filled Adam with dread, a creeping suspicion that they hadn't escaped Brookhaven's grip after all. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, He returned to the patient records they had found. Hidden among the files was a journal belonging to Dr. Grayson. Its pages were filled with cryptic notes and sketches, detailing his experiments and the dark rituals he had performed. One entry caught Adam's attention. The essence of the mind is powerful. It can bind, it can trap, and it can free. But the cost is steep. Once the bond is made, it cannot be undone without a sacrifice. The words chilled him. Had they broken the bindings, or had they simply shifted the asylum's curse onto themselves? Jenna's intuition had been right. Brookhaven wasn't just a building, it was an entity, and it wasn't done with them. The final confrontation came one stormy night, when the whispers grew too loud to ignore. Adam woke to find his house bathed in shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The air was thick, suffocating, and the whispers called his name, beckoning him. As he stumbled through the darkness, he found himself standing before a mirror, but it wasn't his reflection staring back at him. It was the asylum, its decaying walls and sinister symbols etched into the glass. Adam knew he couldn't run any longer. Brookhaven wanted him back, and this time, it wasn't going to let him go. Gathering the journal and the remnants of their equipment, he called Jenna. "It's happening again," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to finish this." Together, they prepared for one last journey into the unknown, knowing that this time, the stakes were higher. Brookhaven wasn't just a story to tell. It was a fight for their very souls. The Midnight Pact. The cold October wind howled through the trees, sending shivers down Olivia's spine as she tightened her jacket around her. The flashlight in her hand flickered, casting erratic beams of light on the narrow dirt path ahead. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, glancing back at the others. "It's Halloween," Chris replied with a grin, his voice carrying an edge of excitement. "What better night to finally check out Devil's Hollow?" "Yeah, because getting cursed sounds like a great time," Olivia muttered, rolling her eyes. She wasn't alone in her hesitation. Jenny, the youngest of the group, kept close to Olivia, her wide eyes darting nervously at every rustling sound. Ben and Marcus, on the other hand, led the way with a kind of reckless confidence that came from years of egging each other on. The five friends had grown up hearing stories about Devil's Hollow. Parents warned their kids to stay away, claiming the area was cursed after a series of unexplained disappearances decades ago. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had vanished. Others whispered about a dark presence that preyed on anyone foolish enough to enter. The stories varied, but they all ended the same. No one came back the same, if they came back at all. "Look," Ben said, pointing ahead. The group emerged into a small clearing, dominated by an ancient, weathered stone altar at its center. Around it, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. "Creepy as hell," Marcus said, but his grin didn't waver. He pulled out his phone, the screen casting a pale glow on his face as he started recording. "This is perfect. Midnight Pact at Devil's Hollow. That'll get us 1 million views." "Don't be stupid," Olivia snapped. "We're here to prove it's just a bunch of stupid stories, not to make a spectacle." "Then you're gonna love this," Marcus said, his flashlight landing on something half buried in the dirt near the altar. He knelt down, brushing away the leaves and revealing an ancient, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the faint outline of strange symbols etched into its surface. "That's probably nothing," Jenny said quickly, backing away. "Let's just go." "Are you kidding?" Chris said, picking up the book. "This is exactly what we came for. It's like something out of a horror movie." "Yeah, and those movies don't exactly end well," Olivia shot back. But Chris had already flipped it open, revealing pages filled with faded, spidery handwriting. The text was written in a language none of them recognized, but some sections had been translated into English. "The Midnight Pact," Chris read aloud. "To summon the spirit of the Hollow, place your hands upon the altar and speak its name. It will grant one wish to each participant, but beware, the pact is eternal. Breaking it will summon the spirit's wrath." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," Olivia said, folding her arms. "Who even writes stuff like this?" "Let's find out," Ben said with a smirk, stepping toward the altar. "No," Olivia snapped, grabbing his arm. "This isn't funny." Let's just leave. But the others were already gathering around the altar, curiosity and adrenaline overriding caution. Come on, Liv, Chris said. It's just a stupid game. What's the worst that could happen? Reluctantly, Olivia joined them, her stomach churning with unease. The group placed their hands on the cold stone surface, and Chris cleared his throat, reading from the book. We call upon the spirit of the hollow, he intoned. Grant us your favor, and we shall honor the pact. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Then, the ground beneath them seemed to shudder, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. Shadows coalesced around the altar, forming a vague, humanoid shape. Its presence was suffocating, its eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. State your wishes, the entity said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. The group stared in stunned silence, the reality of what they had done sinking in. Marcus was the first to speak. I wish to be famous, he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Granted, the entity replied. Its gaze shifted to Ben, who hesitated before saying, I wish to never feel fear again. Granted. One by one, the others made their wishes. Wealth, success, freedom from their insecurities. Olivia was the last, her mind racing as the entity turned to her. I wish to keep my friends safe, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The entity's glowing eyes seemed to bore into her, and for a moment, she thought it wouldn't answer. Then it spoke. Granted. The shadowy form dissolved, leaving the group in stunned silence. That was insane, Marcus said, breaking the silence. Do you think it actually worked? At first, it seemed like nothing had changed. They laughed nervously, brushing off the experience as a bizarre prank. But as the days passed, they realized their wishes had come true, in ways they never could have anticipated. Marcus's YouTube channel exploded in popularity overnight, but the constant scrutiny and pressure drove him to paranoia. Ben found himself unflinchingly fearless, but his recklessness put him in increasingly dangerous situations. Jenny's newfound wealth came with mysterious strings attached, while Chris's success alienated him from his family. And Olivia began to see things. Shadows that didn't belong, figures lurking just out of sight. The spirit's presence was everywhere, its influence growing stronger with each passing day. She realized the wishes weren't gifts, they were chains, binding them to the spirit's will. The breaking point came when Marcus vanished. The group found his apartment ransacked, his equipment destroyed, and his final video, a frantic, rambling monologue, ended with a chilling whisper, "The pact can't be broken." Desperate for answers, Olivia returned to the book, poring over its cryptic text. Hidden among the pages was a second ritual, a way to end the pact, but it required a sacrifice. She gathered the remaining friends, their fear and distrust palpable. "We have to do it," she said, her voice firm despite the terror in her heart. "And who do we sacrifice?" Ben asked, his eyes narrowing. "Because I'm not volunteering." The group devolved into arguments, their unity shattered by the spirit's manipulations. But as the entity's power grew, they had no choice. Returning to Devil's Hollow, they prepared the ritual, each of them carrying the weight of betrayal and survival. As the final incantation was spoken, the spirit appeared, its form more menacing than before. It demanded its price, and in the chaos, one of them made the ultimate choice, stepping forward to face their fate. The ritual ended, the pact broken, but at a cost none of them could bear. As they fled the hollow, the spirit's final words echoed in their minds. "The pact is eternal. You may escape, but you will never be free." The group's escape felt hollow, the air thick with regret and lingering fear. Olivia couldn't shake the memory of the sacrifice, the face of the friend they had lost forever etched into her mind. Days turned into weeks, and yet the whispers persisted. They were faint but unmistakable, as if the spirit were still watching, waiting for an opportunity to return. Jenny withdrew completely, her newfound wealth offering no solace. She claimed she could feel the spirit's touch in every shadow, every creak of her luxurious new home. Chris drowned himself in work, his success becoming an obsession that alienated him further from everyone he cared about. Ben, fearless and reckless, spiraled into danger, each brush with death leaving him unscathed but more unhinged. Olivia tried to hold them together, her wish to keep her friends safe becoming a cruel irony. The spirit's influence had fractured them, and the bonds they once shared felt irreparably broken. Yet she couldn't give up. Something about the spirit's words haunted her. "You may escape, but you will never be free." Driven by a desperate need for closure, Olivia returned to Devil's Hollow alone. The woods felt darker than before, the oppressive weight of the curse pressing down on her with every step. She found the altar untouched, the book still resting where they had left it. Flipping through its pages, she searched for anything they might have missed, any clue that could undo the damage. And then she saw it, a passage written in faded ink, almost invisible against the aged paper. It spoke of a third ritual, one that could sever the pact entirely. But it came with a dire warning. The spirit's power must be faced directly. Those who fail will be claimed. Olivia knew she couldn't do it alone. Gathering her courage, she reached out to the others. Convincing them to return was no easy task, their fear and resentment making them hesitant. But the promise of freedom, however slim, was enough to bring them back to the Hollow. The final ritual required them to confront the spirit in its true form. As they chanted the incantation, the air grew colder, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The spirit emerged, its shape shifting and flickering like a living shadow. Its glowing eyes fixed on them, and Olivia felt an overwhelming wave of dread. "You dare defy the pact?" the spirit hissed, its voice echoing with anger and malice. The group stood their ground, their voices shaking but unbroken as they completed the ritual. The spirit's form began to waver, its power weakening under the weight of their defiance. But it didn't go down without a fight. Shadows lashed out, pulling them into a nightmarish vision of their darkest fears and regrets. Olivia saw the face of their lost friend, heard their voice pleading, accusing her of betrayal. She felt the weight of her guilt threaten to crush her, but she refused to give in. She focused on the ritual, her voice rising above the chaos. Finally, with a deafening roar, the spirit dissolved into nothingness, its presence vanishing like smoke in the wind. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time, the Hollow felt empty. The group emerged from the woods battered but alive, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. They had done it. The pact was broken. Yet the scars remained, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. Olivia looked back one last time, the Hollow now silent and still. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Some pacts should never be made, and some truths are better left buried. The shadows beneath the lake. Lake Haven had always been the heart of summer life in the small town of Willow Creek. Its crystal-clear waters sparkled under the sun, drawing families and vacationers to its shores. Children played on the sandy beaches, teenagers skipped stones, and couples took romantic paddleboat rides. To outsiders, it was a picture-perfect retreat. But the locals whispered a darker story. Over the decades, dozens of swimmers had vanished, their bodies never recovered. Some claimed the lake was bottomless, hiding dangerous currents that dragged people into its depths. Others spoke of a curse, a sinister presence beneath the surface. These tales, passed down through generations, were enough to keep most residents on the shore. But for the Johnson family, newcomers to Willow Creek, the lake was simply a picturesque backdrop to their summer vacation. The Johnsons arrived in late June, eager to escape the noise of city life. The cabin they rented sat on a quiet stretch of the lake, surrounded by towering pines and wildflowers. For Ben, a curious 16-year-old, and his 10-year-old sister Ellie, it was a dream come true. Their parents, Karen and Tom, looked forward to lazy afternoons and evenings around the fire. The lake promised peace, a chance to reconnect as a family. At first, it delivered. The days were filled with laughter and exploration. Ellie spent hours collecting smooth stones along the shore, while Ben took to fishing off the dock. Karen and Tom relaxed on the porch, the scent of pine mingling with the gentle lapping of the water. But beneath the idyllic surface, something stirred. Ellie was the first to notice. While wading in the shallows one afternoon, she saw a shadow dart beneath her feet. Startled, she backed away, calling for Ben. "It's just a fish," he said with a grin, tossing a rock into the water. But Ellie wasn't convinced. The shadow had moved too quickly, too deliberately, as though it were watching her. That night, as the family gathered around the fire, Ellie shared her unease. "There's something in the lake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it." "Probably a trout," Tom said, brushing it off. "This lake's full of them." Ellie frowned but said nothing more. She wanted to believe her father was right, but as she lay in bed, the image of the shadow haunted her. She drifted off to sleep, only to wake with a start hours later. From her window, she could see the lake, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. But something was wrong. The water rippled unnaturally, as though disturbed by unseen hands. And then she saw them, dark shapes rising, just barely breaking the surface before vanishing again. The next morning, Ellie's mood was somber. She refused to go near the water, staying close to the cabin while the others enjoyed the lake. Ben teased her, but she didn't care. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her fears were validated that evening when she ventured to the dock to retrieve her forgotten sandals. The lake was calm, the air still. But as she bent to pick them up, something icy wrapped around her ankle. Ellie screamed, her body yanked toward the edge. She clung to the dock, her fingers digging into the wood as an unseen force tried to drag her into the water. Ben, hearing her cries, raced to her side and pulled her free. Ellie's leg bore deep bruises, shaped like skeletal fingers. "What the hell was that?" Ben muttered, staring at the lake. It was as if the water had returned to normal, its surface serene and undisturbed. Terrified but determined, Ben decided to investigate. The next day, while his parents took Ellie into town to see a doctor, he headed to the local library. What he found chilled him to the core. Old newspaper clippings detailed the disappearances at Lake Haven, some dating back over a century. The articles mentioned strange occurrences, whispers of a curse, and sightings of shadows beneath the water. One account stood out, a diary entry from a survivor who had narrowly escaped drowning. She wrote of hands pulling her under, cold and relentless, and voices calling her name. Ben shared his findings with Ellie that night. "It's not just you," he said, his voice trembling. Something's down there." The siblings decided to tell their parents, but Karen and Tom were skeptical. "You've been reading too many ghost stories," Karen said, though her tone betrayed a hint of worry. Tom agreed to keep a closer eye on the lake, but insisted there was nothing to fear. That night, the shadows returned. This time, they didn't stay in the water. Ben woke to the sound of splashing, followed by heavy footsteps on the dock. Peering out his window, he saw figures emerging from the lake. They moved unnaturally, their bodies dripping and distorted, as though they were struggling to maintain their form. One turned its head, and Ben's breath caught. Its face was a grotesque mix of bone and decayed flesh, its hollow eyes fixed on the cabin. He stumbled back, his heart racing. "Mom! Dad!" he shouted, waking the family. The figures were gone by the time they reached the window, but the dock was wet, puddles leading toward the shore. "We're leaving," Tom said, his voice firm. "First thing in the morning." But the lake had other plans. As dawn broke, they discovered their car wouldn't start. The phone lines were dead, their cell phones had no signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Trapped, the family turned to Ben's research, hoping to find a way to appease the spirits. The diary mentioned an old ritual, one performed by the town's earliest settlers to keep the lake's wrath at bay. It required an offering, something of great personal value, to be cast into the water. Desperate, the family gathered what they could: Karen's wedding ring, Ben's favorite fishing rod, Ellie's beloved stuffed animal. Together, they approached the lake. The water was unnaturally still, the air thick with tension. One by one, they threw their offerings into the lake, each item swallowed by the depths. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the water began to churn violently, and the shadows appeared once more. This time, they didn't attack. Instead, they lingered, their forms flickering as if caught between worlds. A voice echoed from the lake, low and mournful. "Leave this place. Never return." The Johnsons didn't hesitate. They packed what they could carry and fled on foot, reaching the main road hours later. A passing truck driver offered them a ride to town, where they reported everything to the authorities. But when police investigated the cabin, they found no signs of the shadows or the ritual. The lake, as always, was calm and serene. The Johnsons never returned to Lake Haven, but they carried the scars of that summer with them. Ellie refused to go near water, even swimming pools. Ben became obsessed with uncovering the truth, devoting his life to studying the paranormal. Karen and Tom, once avid travelers, chose the safety of home over any vacation. And the lake. It remained quiet and unassuming, waiting for its next visitors. For beneath its surface, the shadows stirred, hungry and patient, ready to claim their next victims. The Keeper of Hollow Hill. Hollow Hill was the kind of place people passed through, not a destination but a stop on the way to somewhere else. The small mining town, nestled in a valley shadowed by towering hills, carried an air of quiet desperation. Its buildings, weathered and leaning with age, seemed to mirror the weariness of the townsfolk who remained. To an outsider like Claire Dawson, it looked like a town caught in time, slowly crumbling under the weight of its secrets. Claire parked her car outside the Hollow Hill General Store, the only business still operating on the main street. She adjusted her bag, stuffed with notebooks, a camera, and a recorder, before stepping inside. The bell above the door jingled, and every conversation in the small space ceased. Heads turned toward her, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Morning," Claire said, forcing a smile. "I'm looking for someone who can tell me about the mines." An old man behind the counter grunted, his leathery face set in a scowl. "Nothing to tell," he muttered. "Mine's been closed for years. Dangerous place." "I've heard that," Claire replied, pulling out her notebook. "I'm a journalist, investigating the disappearances. I think there's a story here that people need to know." A sharp laugh came from a man sitting by the window. "People need to know? Lady, what they need is to stay far away from this place. Write your story, print your paper, but don't think for a second that you're welcome here." Claire's smile faltered, but she wasn't easily deterred. "Why do people think the mines are cursed?" she asked. "What do you know about the Keeper?" The room grew colder, the tension palpable. The old man behind the counter shot the younger man a glare, then turned his attention back to Claire. "You're better off leaving," he said firmly. "Nothing good ever came out of those mines. And nothing good ever will." Undeterred, Claire paid for a bottle of water and left. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked to her car, but she had what she needed, confirmation that the townsfolk knew something. Whatever the truth was, it was buried in the mines, and Claire intended to dig it up. The entrance to the Hollow Hill mines loomed like a gaping mouth, its rusted gates chained shut. Claire's heart raced as she approached, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her chest. She had bribed a local handyman to unlock the gate for her under the cover of night, promising him a significant sum of money. He'd taken the cash and vanished without a word, leaving her alone. The air inside the mine was damp and suffocating, the only sound the crunch of her boots on gravel. Claire switched on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness to reveal jagged walls and abandoned equipment. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. She felt as though she were being watched, the shadows seeming to shift just beyond the edge of her light. She found the first clue deep within a collapsed shaft, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The entries, written by a miner named Samuel Hargrove, described a secret operation conducted by the Hollow Hill Mining Company. They had discovered something ancient, something they weren't meant to find. Samuel's final entry sent chills down Claire's spine. "We shouldn't have gone so deep. There's something here, something alive. It's watching us. It won't let us leave." The journal led her to an area marked with crude symbols carved into the rock. The carvings depicted a monstrous figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, surrounded by kneeling figures. In the center of the chamber was an altar, its surface stained dark. Scattered around it were remnants of bones and tools, as though some ritual had been attempted here long ago. As Claire examined the altar, her flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness. A low, guttural sound echoed through the tunnels, sending a bolt of terror through her. She fumbled with the flashlight, finally managing to turn it back on. The shadows seemed to close in around her, and she realized she was no longer alone. The Keeper emerged from the darkness, its form barely human. Its elongated limbs moved with a grotesque grace, and its hollow eyes glowed faintly. Claire froze, unable to tear her gaze away from the creature. It let out a bone-chilling screech, and she turned and ran, the sound of its pursuit echoing in her ears. She stumbled through the tunnels, her mind racing. She had to find a way to escape, to stop the creature. Her eyes fell on the altar, and she remembered the journal's mention of a ritual. The miners had tried to bind the creature, to trap it within the hill. But they had failed. Claire realized that if she didn't complete the ritual, the keeper would claim her. Using the carvings as a guide, she pieced together the steps of the ritual. It required blood, fire, and an offering of something deeply personal. Claire hesitated, her hands shaking as she searched her bag. She found a locket her mother had given her, the only keepsake she had left. Her chest tightened, but she knew there was no other choice. She placed the locket on the altar and pricked her finger with a jagged rock, letting a drop of blood fall onto the surface. The air grew colder, the keeper's screeches growing louder as it approached. Claire lit a match, holding her breath as she set the locket aflame. The flames roared to life, consuming the offering as the altar began to glow. The keeper lunged at her, but the ritual's power surged through the chamber. A blinding light erupted from the altar, and the creature let out a final, agonized wail before vanishing into the void. The ground beneath Claire trembled, and she barely managed to scramble to safety as the tunnel began to collapse. She emerged into the night, covered in dirt and shaking with exhaustion. The mine's entrance caved in behind her, sealing the horrors within. Claire stared at the hill, the weight of what she had witnessed settling heavily on her shoulders. The keeper was gone, but the scars it had left would never fade. Returning to the town, Claire tried to share her story, but the townsfolk refused to listen. They wanted to forget, to pretend the mines held no secrets. Defeated, Claire left Hollow Hill, vowing to expose the truth in her writing. But deep down, she knew the hill's darkness would never truly be gone. Years later, Claire's article would spark curiosity in those who read it. Some would dismiss it as fiction, but others would feel the pull of Hollow Hill, drawn to its mystery. And the hill, patient and eternal, would wait for them, its keeper stirring once more in the shadows. Claire's life changed irrevocably after Hollow Hill. The experience left her with a mix of trauma and determination. She moved to the city, seeking refuge in the noise and anonymity it offered, but the memories of the hill haunted her nights. Her dreams were plagued with the keeper's hollow eyes and the wails that echoed through the collapsing tunnels. The article she wrote became a sensation, drawing the attention of conspiracy theorists, paranormal enthusiasts, and skeptics alike. Some hailed her as a courageous journalist uncovering hidden truths. Others accused her of fabricating a sensational story for fame. The scrutiny only deepened her isolation, as Claire found herself caught between wanting to warn others and fearing they might suffer the same fate she narrowly escaped. But Hollow Hill was not done with her. Months after the article's publication, Claire received an anonymous package. Inside was an old, rusted lantern, one she recognized from the mines. Attached to it was a note scrawled in jagged handwriting, "It's still waiting." Her blood ran cold. The thought that someone else had ventured into the mines, or worse, that the keeper had found a way to reach her, sent her into a spiral of paranoia. She changed her locks, installed cameras, and avoided anyone she didn't trust completely. Despite her fear, a part of her felt drawn back to Hollow Hill. Questions lingered in her mind. What exactly was the keeper? Was it truly gone, or had she merely delayed the inevitable? Against her better judgment, Claire began researching ancient rituals and folklore, hoping to find answers that could put her mind at ease. The deeper she delved, the more she realized how little she understood about what she had encountered. One rainy evening, Claire's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It contained a single image, the collapsed mine entrance, now cleared of rubble. Beneath it was a caption, "You left something unfinished." Panic gripped her, but alongside it came a grim resolve. Claire knew she couldn't run forever. If the hill wanted her, she would have to face it, on her terms. Armed with her research, she returned to Hollow Hill, this time prepared for whatever awaited her. The town was even emptier than before, its streets silent and desolate. The general store was boarded up, and the few remaining residents avoided her gaze. The mine entrance loomed ahead, its gaping maw inviting her back into the darkness. With a deep breath, Claire stepped inside. The air was colder than she remembered, and the oppressive weight of the hill seemed to press down on her. As she navigated the familiar tunnels, she noticed new carvings on the walls, symbols that hadn't been there before. They pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the deeper she went, the more they seemed to glow. In the chamber with the altar, the scene was eerily unchanged. The remnants of her previous offering lay scattered, but the air was thick with a new energy. Claire set down her bag, pulling out the tools she had brought: candles, a ceremonial dagger, and a vial of salt water. She didn't know if her research would work, but it was all she had. As she began the ritual, the ground trembled, and the keeper emerged from the shadows once more. Its form was more defined this time, its hollow eyes burning with rage. Claire's hands shook, but she forced herself to continue, chanting the incantation she had memorized. The creature screeched, lunging at her, but a barrier of light erupted around the altar, holding it at bay. The ritual demanded a final act, an offering of her deepest fear. Claire closed her eyes, letting the memories she had buried rise to the surface. She saw herself as a child, cowering in the dark as her parents fought in the next room. She felt the weight of loneliness, the fear of failure that had driven her to Hollow Hill in the first place. Tears streamed down her face as she poured those emotions into the ritual, her voice breaking but unyielding. The keeper let out an ear-splitting wail as the light from the altar engulfed it. The ground shook violently, and Claire was thrown back as the chamber collapsed around her. Crawling through the rubble, she found her way to the surface just as the first rays of dawn broke over the hill. The mine entrance was gone, buried under tons of earth. Claire stood there, bruised and battered, but alive. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. Whatever the keeper had been, it was gone now, truly gone. As she drove away from Hollow Hill, Claire couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The hill stood silent and still, its secrets buried once more. But deep down, she knew that some places are never truly at rest, and some shadows never stop watching. Through the keyhole. The Parker family, David, Emma, their teenage daughter Sophie, and 6-year-old Liam, had always dreamed of leaving the noise and chaos of city life behind. When they stumbled upon a charming countryside home nestled among rolling hills and sprawling meadows, it felt like fate. The house was everything they had hoped for. Spacious yet cozy, with a wide porch perfect for summer evenings and a basement that David planned to turn into a workshop. For the first few weeks, life at the new house was idyllic. Sophie spent her afternoons painting in the garden, Liam explored the nearby woods with their golden retriever, Max, and Emma relished the quiet mornings with her coffee and a book. David, ever the handyman, threw himself into small projects, fixing squeaky hinges and repainting faded shutters. It felt like the fresh start they needed. But the peace didn't last. It began with Liam's discovery in the basement. "Dad," he called one afternoon, his voice echoing up the stairs. "There's a door down here, but it's locked." David frowned, descending the stairs. He had spent hours in the basement unpacking and organizing but hadn't noticed any door besides the one leading to the laundry room. Yet there it was. A small, weathered door tucked into the far corner, partially obscured by a stack of old crates. Its surface was unremarkable, but the heavy iron lock that secured it seemed oddly out of place. "That's strange," David murmured, kneeling to inspect it. He tugged at the handle, but the door didn't budge. "It's probably just a storage closet. I'll look for the key later." But no key surfaced, and as the days passed, Liam's fascination with the door grew. "What's behind it?" he asked over breakfast. "Why is it locked?" Emma chuckled, ruffling his hair. "It's probably just empty, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." But Liam wasn't convinced. He began spending more time in the basement, sitting cross-legged in front of the door, as if waiting for it to reveal its secrets. Sophie teased him, calling it his secret clubhouse, but even she admitted there was something unsettling about the door. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible. Emma thought she heard her name while folding laundry, and David swore he heard laughter when no one else was home. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until there was no denying their presence. Sophie, ever skeptical, brushed it off as wind or the house settling. But Liam's reaction was different. "They're talking to me," he told Emma one night, his wide eyes brimming with fear. "They want me to open the door." Emma's blood ran cold. She tried to reassure him, brushing off his words as a child's imagination, but the unease lingered. The next morning, she shared Liam's claim with David, who decided it was time to deal with the door once and for all. With a crowbar in hand, David descended into the basement, Emma close behind. Sophie and Liam watched anxiously from the top of the stairs. The lock was old but sturdy, and it took several minutes of effort before it finally gave way with a loud snap. David hesitated, his hand on the handle, before pulling the door open. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang. Behind the door was a narrow staircase spiraling downward, disappearing into darkness. Emma shivered. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "The blueprints didn't show anything like this." "Stay here," David instructed, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll take a quick look." The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The space below was massive, far larger than the house above should have allowed. The walls were rough-hewn stone, and the floor was littered with debris. Broken furniture, scattered bones, and symbols scrawled in dark, dried streaks that David didn't want to identify. At the center of the cavern stood an altar, its surface covered in melted candles and more of the strange symbols. David's stomach churned as he approached, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He reached out to touch one of the carvings, but a low growl echoed through the cavern, stopping him cold. He spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly. Shadows danced across the walls, shifting and coalescing into forms that were almost, but not quite, human. David backed away slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The growl grew louder, joined by a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "David!" Emma's voice called from the top of the stairs, snapping him out of his trance. He turned and bolted up the steps, slamming the door shut behind him. "What did you see?" Emma demanded, her face pale. David shook his head. I don't know. But we need to seal that door." The family spent the next few days avoiding the basement, but the house itself seemed to rebel against their decision. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed in the middle of the night, and the whispers became a constant presence. Liam began waking up screaming, claiming shadowy figures were watching him from the corners of his room. Desperate for answers, Emma turned to the local library, digging through old records and newspapers. She found a single mention of their property in an article from the late 1800s. The previous owner, a recluse named Elias Harrow, had been accused of conducting dark rituals. He vanished under mysterious circumstances, and the house had changed hands countless times since, each owner leaving under strange and often tragic circumstances. Armed with this knowledge, Emma confronted David. "We can't stay here," she said. "This place isn't safe." David nodded, his resolve faltering. "I'll start looking for a new place," he promised. But the entities had other plans. One night, as the family sat in the living room, the door to the basement creaked open on its own. A chill filled the room, and the whispers grew deafening. The Parkers froze, their terror palpable as the shadows began to seep out from the open door, twisting and writhing like living smoke. "We need to seal it," David said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Now." Grabbing the materials he had prepared earlier, boards, nails, and a can of salt, David and Emma hurried to the basement. Sophie and Liam clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. As David worked to nail the door shut, Emma spread a line of salt along the threshold, reciting a protection prayer she had found in her research. But the shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they pressed against the door, causing it to bulge and splinter. A guttural roar shook the house, and the symbols on the altar flashed in David's mind. "The ritual," he said suddenly. "We have to finish the ritual." Emma hesitated but nodded. Together, they descended into the cavern once more, the oppressive darkness threatening to smother them. The altar seemed to pulse with energy, and the shadows coiled around it like snakes. Following Emma's research, they began the ritual, using the candles and symbols she had copied from the library archives. The air grew colder with each word they spoke, and the shadows writhed in agony. the cavern trembled, and a deafening roar filled the space as the final incantation was spoken. The shadows converged on the altar, their forms twisting and collapsing inward until they vanished with a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the cavern was silent. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. David and Emma climbed the stairs, their limbs heavy with exhaustion. The basement door was closed, and the house was quiet once more. The Parkers left the house the next morning, taking only what they could carry. They never returned, and the house was left to decay, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. But those who passed by swore they could hear whispers on the wind, and at night, a faint glow emanated from the basement window, as if the shadows were waiting for someone to find them again. The Blood Moon Chronicles. The village of Coldwell was nestled deep in the forested mountains, isolated from the world by its rugged terrain and shrouded in an eerie silence. Most outsiders who stumbled upon the remote settlement dismissed it as an unremarkable speck on the map. But every 13 years, when the blood moon rose, Coldwell became something else entirely. A place of fear, mystery, and whispered warnings. For generations, the townsfolk had passed down stories of the blood moon, a celestial event that painted the sky in crimson hues and heralded unspeakable horrors. The villagers treated the occasion with a mix of dread and reverence, boarding up their homes and sealing themselves inside long before dusk. To them, the blood moon was not just an astronomical phenomenon, it was a harbinger of doom. Nina Marshall, an ambitious journalist with a taste for the unconventional, first heard of Coldwell's peculiar tradition through an obscure online forum. Intrigued by the mix of folklore and superstition, she saw it as the perfect subject for an exposé. Dismissing the warnings as nothing more than rural paranoia, she packed her camera, notebook, and recorder and set off for Coldwell a week before the blood moon was due to rise. The journey to the village was long and arduous, the winding mountain roads barely wide enough for her car. By the time she arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the weathered cottages and cobblestone streets. Coldwell looked like a place trapped in time, its charm marred by an underlying tension that Nina couldn't ignore. The air felt heavy, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Her arrival was met with suspicion. The villagers were wary of outsiders, their guarded expressions making it clear that Nina was not welcome. She rented a room above the town's only pub, run by a stout, no-nonsense woman named Margaret. Despite her initial reluctance, Margaret offered Nina a few words of advice over a pint of bitter ale. Leave before the blood moon rises. You don't want to be here when it happens. Nina pressed for details, but Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. Some things are better left alone, she said, before turning her attention back to the bar. Undeterred, Nina spent the next few days exploring the village and interviewing its residents. Most were tight-lipped, brushing off her questions or retreating behind closed doors. The few who did speak to her shared cryptic warnings. When the sky bleeds, the shadows come alive. The blood moon changes everything. Pray you're indoors when it rises. On the eve of the blood moon, Nina noticed the villagers' preparations intensifying. Windows were boarded up, doors reinforced with heavy beams, and salt lines were drawn across thresholds. The streets emptied by mid-afternoon, leaving the village eerily quiet. Nina, determined to uncover the truth, ignored their warnings and set up her equipment near the central square. She planned to document the event firsthand, confident that her skepticism would be validated. As the first sliver of the blood moon appeared on the horizon, Nina felt an unexpected chill. The temperature seemed to drop, and the once still air grew restless. The sky darkened unnaturally, the stars swallowed by an ominous red glow. It was then that she heard the first scream. Nina whipped around, her camera capturing a figure staggering into the square. It was an elderly man she had interviewed earlier, his face contorted in agony. Before her eyes, his body convulsed, limbs twisting and elongating in grotesque ways. His nails grew into claws, his teeth sharpening into fangs. Within moments, he was no longer human but a feral creature with glowing red eyes and a blood-curdling snarl. Panicked, Nina grabbed her equipment and bolted for the pub. She barely made it inside before Margaret slammed the door shut and bolted it with a thick iron bar. "You idiot!" Margaret hissed. "I told you to stay indoors." "What the hell was that?" Nina demanded, her voice trembling. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she handed Nina a shotgun and a handful of shells. "If you want to live through the night, you'll need this." The next few hours were a nightmare. From her perch at the window, Nina watched as the village transformed into a battleground. Shadowy figures roamed the streets, their forms shifting and indistinct. They moved with inhuman speed, dragging anyone caught outside into the darkness. The feral creatures, once villagers, prowled hungrily, their howls echoing through the night. "This is what happens during the blood moon," Margaret explained, her voice grim. "It's the curse." "What curse?" Nina asked, her hands trembling as she reloaded the shotgun. Margaret sighed, her gaze distant. "A long time ago, the founders of this village made a deal. They wanted protection from the dangers of the wilderness. But the ritual they performed went wrong. Instead of keeping evil out, they let it in. Now, every 13 years, the blood moon reminds us of their mistake." Determined to understand more, Nina pressed Margaret for details. The older woman reluctantly revealed that the only way to end the curse was to destroy the artifact used in the ritual, a stone tablet inscribed with forbidden symbols, hidden somewhere within the forest. As the night wore on, the pub came under attack. The creatures clawed at the windows and pounded on the doors, their snarls and growls a constant threat. Margaret and Nina fought to keep them at bay, but the barricades wouldn't hold forever. Realizing she had no choice, Nina made a desperate decision. "I'm going to find that tablet," she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You're insane," Margaret replied. "You'll never survive out there." "If I don't, we're all dead anyway," Nina said, grabbing a lantern and the shotgun. "Tell me where to start looking." Margaret hesitated before nodding. "There's a clearing to the east, near the old well. That's where they performed the ritual. If the tablet's anywhere, it'll be there." With Margaret's reluctant blessing, Nina slipped out through the back door, the blood moon casting an eerie light on the village. Every step through the deserted streets was a test of her courage, the shadows seeming to close in around her. The howls of the creatures grew louder, and she could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. Reaching the edge of the forest, Nina forced herself to move forward. The trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft and treacherous. At last, she reached the clearing. In the center stood the old well, its stones crumbling with age. Surrounding it were remnants of the ritual, melted candles, scattered bones, and the faint outline of symbols carved into the ground. At the base of the well lay the tablet, its surface glowing faintly in the crimson light. Nina approached cautiously, her breath catching as she saw the symbols up close. They seemed to writhe and shift, as though alive. As she reached out to pick it up, a guttural growl froze her in place. Turning slowly, she saw one of the creatures standing at the edge of the clearing, its red eyes locked on her. The next moments were a blur. Nina fired the shotgun, the blast echoing through the forest as the creature lunged. She scrambled backward, clutching the tablet as more creatures emerged from the shadows. With no other option, she ran, the tablet heavy in her arms and the monsters close behind. Reaching the village just as dawn began to break, Nina stumbled into the pub, collapsing onto the floor. Margaret slammed the door shut behind her, helping her to her feet. "Did you get it?" she asked. Nina held up the tablet, her hands trembling. "What do we do now?" Margaret grabbed a hammer and chisel from behind the bar. "We end this." Together, they shattered the tablet, the pieces dissolving into ash as the first rays of sunlight touched them. The air grew still, and the shadows receded, leaving the village in an uneasy silence. The blood moon had passed, and for the first time in generations, Coldwell felt at peace. But as Nina looked out at the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched from the darkness, waiting for the next mistake to be made. What lurks in the cellar? The Kendricks family had always dreamed of owning a home where they could settle down and build a new chapter of their lives. When they stumbled upon the old Victorian fixer-upper on the outskirts of town, it seemed like fate. The house, with its wide porch and intricate woodwork, exuded a certain charm despite its age and the layers of neglect. David and Laura Kendrick were eager to pour their savings into renovations, believing the house could become a haven for their family. Their teenage daughter, Emma, wasn't as enthusiastic. At 17, she found the creaking floors and peeling wallpaper more unsettling than quaint. Her younger brother, Noah, aged 9, was more open-minded, already envisioning adventures in the sprawling backyard and the attic that seemed straight out of a mystery novel. But it wasn't the attic that captured their attention during the initial tour, it was the cellar. The cellar door was an imposing slab of wood set into the hallway floor near the kitchen, secured by a rusted iron padlock. Their real estate agent had shrugged off the oddity, claiming the previous owner had lost the key years ago. "You can always have a locksmith take care of it," she'd said, her voice breezy. But when David tried to saw through the lock on their first day in the house, his blade snapped clean in two. Subsequent attempts, a crowbar, a drill, even a small blowtorch, all failed. The lock seemed impervious, an enigma that unnerved them more than they cared to admit. For the first few weeks, the Kendricks busied themselves with renovations. Laura threw herself into painting the walls and tearing up old carpets, while David tackled the plumbing and rewiring. Emma spent her time begrudgingly unpacking and texting her friends about how much she missed the city. Noah, curious and adventurous, often lingered by the cellar door, pressing his ear against the wood. "What do you hear?" Emma asked one afternoon, her tone half-mocking. Noah's brow furrowed. "It sounds like scratching," he said. "And sometimes, like someone crying." Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. She didn't admit it, but she'd heard things too, faint whispers late at night when the house should have been silent. She told herself it was just the wind or the old pipe settling, but the rationalizations felt increasingly hollow. One night, Emma woke to the sound of a door creaking. Her room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway, where a faint glow spilled up from below. Confused and groggy, she slipped out of bed and stepped into the corridor. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the cellar door ajar, its heavy lock dangling open as if it had never been broken. Against her better judgment, Emma descended the steep, creaking stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the faint smell of damp earth mingling with something metallic. At the bottom, she found herself in a space that defied logic. The cellar wasn't just a cellar, it was a cavernous expanse, its walls stretching into shadows that her flashlight couldn't penetrate. The floor was littered with detritus, broken furniture, ancient tools, and bones, too large to belong to any animal she could name. At the center of the room was the source of the metallic smell, a pulsing, otherworldly object that looked alive. It hovered a few inches off the ground, its surface shifting between liquid and solid. Emma felt a pull, as if the thing were reaching for her mind, whispering in a language she didn't understand. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a skeletal arm half buried in the dirt. She fled up the stairs, slamming the cellar door shut behind her and shoving a heavy chair over it for good measure. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. The whispers, the pulsing object, the bones. It was too much. The next morning, Emma tried to tell her parents what she had found, but they dismissed her as overly imaginative. "You were probably dreaming," Laura said, though her voice wavered. "I wasn't dreaming," Emma insisted. "There's something down there. Something wrong." David promised to check it out, but when he tried to open the door, the lock was firmly in place, as if it had never been removed. Emma stared in disbelief, her protests falling on deaf ears. Over the following days, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Objects moved inexplicably, lights flickered despite the new wiring, and cold spots appeared in rooms that had been warm moments before. The scratching sounds grew louder, and the whispers became a constant undercurrent, faint but impossible to ignore. Noah was the first to disappear. Emma woke one morning to find his bed empty, the sheets rumpled as if he'd left in a hurry. Panic gripped the family as they searched the house and the surrounding property, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. It wasn't until Emma heard the faint sound of sobbing coming from the cellar that she realized where he must be. "He's down there!" she shouted, banging on the locked door. David and Laura joined her, their combined strength finally breaking the hinges and sending the door crashing open. They descended into the darkness, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the cavernous space. They found Noah crouched near the pulsing object, his face pale and tear-streaked. "It won't let me go," he whispered, his voice trembling. As David reached for him, the object flared with light, and a force threw them all backward. The whispers grew deafening, coalescing into a voice that spoke directly into their minds. "Your fear feeds me. Your presence strengthens me." The family fled up the stairs, dragging Noah with them. But the entity wasn't content to let them go. The cellar door slammed shut behind them, and the house itself seemed to turn against them. Walls shifted, doorways led to nowhere, and shadows stretched unnaturally, blocking their path. Emma realized that the entity was growing stronger with each passing moment. They had to find a way to close the portal before it consumed them all. She remembered the symbols she had seen on the walls of the cellar and scoured the internet for anything similar. Hours of frantic searching led her to an ancient ritual designed to banish entities from their realms. The ritual required a personal sacrifice, something of deep emotional significance. Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed her grandmother's locket, the one thing she treasured most, and descended into the cellar with her family. They formed a circle around the pulsing object, reciting the incantation Emma had found. The air grew colder, the whispers turning to screams as the entity thrashed against their efforts. As Emma placed the locket at the base of the object, it let out a final, ear-splitting wail before imploding into itself, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The cellar walls trembled, then began to collapse. The family scrambled up the stairs, barely escaping as the house groaned and settled into an eerie stillness. They left that night, taking only what they could carry. The house was condemned and eventually demolished, but Emma knew the entity wasn't truly gone. It was waiting, lurking in the remnants of the cellar, ready to feed on the next family brave enough to move in. Weeks after leaving, Emma found herself plagued by nightmares. In her dreams, she was back in the cellar, the pulsing object's whispers pulling her closer. Each time she awoke, the sense of dread lingered, a constant reminder that their escape might have been temporary. David and Laura noticed her restlessness but didn't press her. They were too busy trying to rebuild their lives. One evening, while unpacking boxes in their temporary rental, Emma stumbled upon an old photo of the Victorian house. It had been tucked into a history book they'd taken from the library during their research. The photo showed the house as it had been decades ago, pristine and full of life. But something in the background caught her eye. A faint figure in one of the windows, its shadowy form eerily familiar. Emma's chest tightened. She turned the photo over, finding a note scrawled in faded ink, "Beware what lies below." The nightmares grew worse after that. In her dreams, the figure from the photo appeared at the foot of her bed, its shadow stretching across the room. Each night, it came closer, its whispers growing louder. Emma began to wonder if the entity had truly been banished, or if it had found a way to follow them. Desperate for answers, she contacted a paranormal investigator she had read about online. The investigator, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Marks, listened patiently as Emma recounted her story. When Emma finished, Evelyn's expression was grim. "The kind of entity you're describing doesn't simply vanish," Evelyn said. "It feeds on fear, and it's clever. By leaving the house, you may have disrupted its connection, but if it's strong enough, it can re-establish a link, especially if it has a personal tether to someone." Emma's stomach sank. "The locket," she whispered. "I used it in the ritual. It was my grandmother's." Evelyn nodded. "That might explain it. You gave it a piece of your emotional energy. That connection could be keeping it alive. What do I do?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "There's one option," Evelyn said. "You'll need to go back. Destroy the remnants of the cellar. Burn everything. And sever any ties you have to the house." Emma's heart raced. The thought of returning to that place filled her with dread, but she knew Evelyn was right. The entity wasn't just haunting her dreams, it was waiting for an opportunity to strike again. Gathering her courage, she convinced her family to join her on one final trip to the house. When they arrived, the house was a shell of its former self. The windows were boarded up, the porch sagging under years of neglect. The cellar door was still intact, the padlock now rusted beyond recognition. With Evelyn's guidance, they descended into the remnants of the cellar, armed with gasoline and matches. The pulsing object was gone, but the energy in the space was palpable. The walls seemed to hum, the whispers faint but insistent. Emma placed the photo of the house on the ground, doused it in gasoline, and struck a match. As the flames consumed the image, the whispers turned into screams. The ground shook, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning wood and decay. The family fled as the house collapsed in on itself, the flames devouring everything. For the first time in months, Emma felt a sense of relief. They had destroyed the entity's anchor, severing its hold on them. Or so they hoped. Years later, Emma couldn't help but wonder if the entity had truly been vanquished. On quiet nights, when the wind howled and shadows danced on her bedroom walls, she sometimes thought she heard whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And she couldn't shake the feeling that one day, the entity would find its way back. The silent scream of Blackwood Manor. When Caroline first laid eyes on Blackwood Manor, it was like stepping into a dream. The sprawling estate, with its ivy-covered walls and towering gables, seemed to emerge from the mist as if from a storybook. After a tumultuous year marked by heartbreak and loss, inheriting the manor felt like a lifeline, a chance to leave her troubled past behind and start anew. The locals, however, did not share her enthusiasm. "That place is cursed," warned the grocer, an elderly man with deep lines etched into his face. "Everyone who lives there, they either go mad or disappear." Caroline brushed off his words as small-town superstition, the kind of folklore that clings to old, abandoned places. She was determined to make Blackwood Manor her sanctuary, a place to heal and rebuild her life. With her belongings in tow and a heart full of cautious optimism, she moved in on a misty October afternoon. The house was every bit as grand as she'd imagined, though time and neglect had taken their toll. Dust blanketed the antique furniture, cobwebs clung to the ornate chandeliers, and the air carried a faint, musty odor. Still, Caroline felt a strange connection to the place, as if it had been waiting for her. Her first night in the manor passed uneventfully, though she found the silence unnerving. The countryside was far removed from the constant hum of the city, and the stillness seemed almost oppressive. As she lay in bed, the weight of the house pressed down on her, making her feel small and vulnerable. It was the second night when she first heard the screams. They came suddenly, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the darkened halls. Caroline bolted upright, her heart pounding. She strained her ears, but the sound had already faded. Dismissing it as a figment of her imagination, she forced herself to go back to sleep. But the screams returned. Night after night, they grew louder and more anguished, reverberating through the manor like the cries of a wounded animal. Caroline's initial fear gave way to curiosity. She began exploring the house during the day, searching for the source of the sounds. It was during one of these explorations that she stumbled upon the study. The room was tucked away at the end of a long, shadowy corridor. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and an old leather-bound journal. As she sifted through the items, a chilling story began to unfold. Decades ago, Blackwood Manor had been the site of a gruesome family massacre. The details were sparse, but the journal hinted at dark rituals, a child's disappearance, and whispers of an unspeakable force that had claimed the house as its own. Caroline's hands trembled as she read the final entry. "The screams will not stop. They're warning us. Something is coming. Something is here." That night, the dreams began. Caroline found herself wandering the halls of the manor in her sleep, her footsteps echoing against the cold stone floors. Her dreams were vivid and haunting, filled with shadowy figures and a blood-soaked child who stared at her with hollow eyes. The child never spoke, but his presence filled her with a sense of dread so profound it left her gasping for air when she woke. As the days turned into weeks, the house seemed to come alive. Shadows moved where there was no light, doors creaked open on their own, and cold spots appeared in the warmest rooms. Caroline felt the weight of unseen eyes on her at all times. The screams grew louder, now accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The whispers were not random. They spoke in fragmented sentences, warning her to leave, to run before it was too late. But Caroline's curiosity outweighed her fear. She began piecing together the history of the manor, poring over the journal and the records she'd found. The previous owners, all of whom had met tragic ends, had reported similar phenomena: the screams, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. Through her research, Caroline uncovered the truth about the child in her dreams. His name was Thomas Blackwood, the youngest son of the manor's original owners. He had been the sole survivor of the massacre, though he disappeared shortly after. Local legend claimed that Thomas had been taken by the entity that haunted the house, a sinister force bound to the manor by an ancient ritual gone wrong. The more Caroline learned, the more dangerous the house became. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the halls at all hours. The shadows grew bolder, darting across her peripheral vision and brushing against her skin. The blood-soaked child began appearing not only in her dreams but also in the waking hours, standing at the foot of her bed or peering around corners. One evening, as Caroline sat in the study, the journal opened before her, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath fogged in the air, and the pages of the journal began to flip on their own. A single word appeared, scrawled in blood-red ink. "Leave." Terrified, Caroline tried to flee the house, but the doors refused to budge. The windows, once fragile with age, now seemed impenetrable. The manor had trapped her, its walls pulsing with a malevolent energy that grew stronger with each passing moment. It was then that she realized the spirits were not her enemies. The screams, the warnings, they were trying to protect her. They wanted her to leave, to escape the fate that had claimed so many before her. But the entity, the true master of the house, would not let her go so easily. Desperate, Caroline turned to the journal for guidance. Among the cryptic entries, she found a ritual meant to banish the entity. The instructions were incomplete, but it was her only hope. Gathering the materials listed, candles, salt, and a dagger, she prepared herself for the confrontation. As the blood moon rose that night, casting an eerie red glow over the manor, Caroline began the ritual. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the walls trembled as the entity manifested before her. It was a towering, shadowy figure, its form constantly shifting, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The spirits of the house rallied around her, their ghostly forms shielding her from the entity's wrath. With trembling hands, Caroline recited the incantation, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams and roars. The entity lashed out, its tendrils of darkness slicing through the air, but the spirits held firm, giving Caroline the time she needed. As she drove the dagger into the center of the salt circle, a blinding light filled the room. The entity let out an unearthly wail before collapsing in on itself, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The spirits, their task complete, faded one by one, their anguished screams replaced by a profound sense of peace. Exhausted and shaken, Caroline stumbled out of the manor as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. She looked back one last time, the house now silent and still, its windows reflecting the morning light. Though she had survived, she knew the manor would never truly be free of its darkness. It would wait, as it always had, for the next soul brave enough, or foolish enough, to call it home. Years later, Caroline would write a book about her time in Blackwood Manor. The Silent Scream of Blackwood became a bestseller, capturing the imaginations of readers around the world. But no matter how many people praised her story, Caroline knew that the true horrors of the manor could never be fully conveyed in words. On quiet nights, when the wind howled and the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far, she would still hear the faint echo of a scream, reminding her of what she had left behind. Yet the story did not end with Caroline. Decades later, a new family moved into Blackwood Manor, lured by the same promise of beauty and a fresh start. They laughed off the warnings of locals and saw the house not as a cursed relic, but as a chance to build their dreams. But on their first night, the youngest daughter, Sophie, woke to the sound of faint, anguished screams echoing through the halls. The Grinning Stranger. Millhaven was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. Nestled between rolling hills and sprawling forests, it was a quiet place where life moved slowly. The town's biggest excitement came from the annual fair or a new diner opening on Main Street. But that tranquility was shattered the day the Grinning Stranger appeared. The first sighting was by Margaret Turner, an elderly widow who swore she'd seen a man in a black suit standing under the streetlight outside her home. "He didn't move," she told her neighbor the next day. "Just stood there, staring at my window with that horrible grin." Her neighbor laughed it off, chalking it up to Margaret's overactive imagination. But within days, others began reporting similar encounters. The figure was always the same, tall and gaunt, dressed impeccably in a black suit with a tie that seemed almost too tight. His face bore a grotesque grin, stretched wide and unnatural, as if someone had carved it into his skin. His eyes, cold and lifeless, never blinked. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, staring. At first, the townsfolk dismissed the sightings as an elaborate prank. Teenagers looking for a thrill, perhaps, or an eccentric drifter passing through. But then people began disappearing. It started with the town's mechanic, James Keller, who failed to show up for work one morning. His wife found their home empty, his tools untouched, his truck parked in the driveway. The only clue was the front door, left wide open. Over the next week, 3 more residents vanished without a trace. Panic spread like wildfire. Parents kept their children indoors, businesses closed early, and the streets of Millhaven emptied before dusk. The grinning stranger, it seemed, was always nearby when someone disappeared. He was seen standing on street corners, outside homes, and even in the schoolyard. His presence was silent but suffocating, a dark cloud over the town. Claire Morgan, a high school English teacher, first heard about the grinning stranger from her students. They whispered about him in hushed tones, sharing stories of friends who had seen him. Claire dismissed their tales as typical teenage gossip, until one of her students, Sarah Whitman, failed to show up for class. Sarah was one of Claire's brightest students, a shy girl with a passion for literature. When Claire called her home, there was no answer. Concerned, she drove to the Whitman residence, only to find the house eerily quiet. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the air felt heavy, the silence oppressive. Sarah's parents were gone, too. The only sign of life was a single open book on the kitchen table, its pages fluttering as if caught by an unseen wind. Claire's unease turned to dread when she spotted him. The grinning stranger stood at the edge of the Whitman's yard, motionless. His grin seemed wider than in the description she'd heard, his hollow eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she was paralyzed, unable to look away. Then came the whispers. They weren't words, exactly. More like fragments of thought, raw and invasive. They pierced her mind, dredging up memories she had buried long ago. The death of her younger brother, the guilt she carried for not being there, the doubt she harbored about her ability to protect her students. The whispers grew louder, suffocating her until she stumbled backward, breaking eye contact. When she looked again, he was gone. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. The whispers echoed in her mind, blending with the memories she had fought so hard to suppress. She began researching the grinning stranger, poring over old newspapers and online forums. What she found chilled her to the bone. The grinning stranger wasn't new to Millhaven. He had appeared in other towns, dating back over a century. In each instance, the pattern was the same. Sightings of a man in a black suit, followed by a series of disappearances. The towns were left in shambles, their residents consumed by fear and paranoia. In every case, the stranger vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of his presence. Claire's obsession with the grinning stranger deepened as more of her students disappeared. She noticed the pattern. The stranger seemed to target those with deep fears or regrets, preying on their vulnerabilities. He wasn't just a passive observer. He was a catalyst, amplifying the darkness within his victims until it consumed them. One evening, Claire received a message on her answering machine. The voice was distorted, crackling with static, but she recognized it as Sarah's. "He's coming for you," the voice whispered. "Don't let him in." The call sent shivers down her spine. Claire began fortifying her home, locking every door and window, drawing the curtains tight. She kept a flashlight and a kitchen knife by her bedside, though she doubted they would be of any use. The grinning stranger wasn't human, at least, not entirely. Over the following days, Claire's paranoia grew. She saw the stranger everywhere, in the reflection of a shop window, standing in the distance at the park, even in the hallway outside her classroom. She began to question her sanity, unsure if the sightings were real or hallucinations brought on by fear. One night, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Claire heard a knock at her door. Her heart raced as she approached, clutching the knife tightly. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent. Summoning her courage, she flung the door open, only to find the grinning stranger standing there, his face inches from hers. Before she could react, he raised a hand and pointed past her, into the house. Claire turned and saw shadows pooling in the corners of her living room, coalescing into shapes that writhed and pulsed. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling her mind with unbearable noise. She dropped the knife, clutching her head as the world spun around her. In that moment, Claire understood the truth. The grinning stranger wasn't the source of the darkness. He was its herald, a warning of what was to come. The shadows weren't his creation. They were the manifestation of Millhaven's collective fear and regret, drawn to the surface by his presence. With her last ounce of strength, Claire focused on the whispers, sifting through the noise until she found a single coherent thought. Confront him! Claire turned back to the stranger, meeting his unblinking gaze. The whispers grew deafening, but she held her ground, refusing to look away. Slowly, the grin on his face began to falter, his features contorting into something resembling pain. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room. The stranger's form flickered, his edges blurring as if he were a projection. For the first time, he spoke, his voice hollow and distant. "You cannot escape what lies within." With that, he vanished, leaving Claire alone in the silent, storm-lit house. The disappearances in Millhaven stopped after that night. The grinning stranger was never seen again, though his presence lingered in the minds of those who had encountered him. Claire continued teaching, but she was forever changed. She knew that the darkness the stranger had revealed wasn't unique to Millhaven. It was a part of every human soul, waiting for the right moment to surface. Years later, Claire would write a book about her experiences, titled The Grinning Stranger. It became a bestseller, though many dismissed it as fiction. But Claire knew the truth. On quiet nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the shadows seemed to move on their own, she could still feel his gaze, and the faint echo of a grin.